The Lost Tribes of Israel, Volume 2, Deportations by Assyria. The Israelite conquest of the Promised Land starts with Joshua's success at the Battle of Jericho. The precise date for this famous battle is a subject debated among archaeologists and historians. One opinion places the event at the close of the 15th century BC, during which all the city's inhabitants were slaughtered, except for those in the house with Rahab, the Canaanite whore. Rahab displayed her faith in God by helping the Israelite spies at Jericho. See Joshua chapter 2. In return for her assistance, the spies told the woman to bind a line of scarlet thread in the window. This secret signal indicated that her home should be spared, and when the city fell, Rahab was saved. Later, we find her linked with the Pharez branch of Judah in the genealogy of Matthew chapter 1, verse 5. Rahab's scarlet thread reminds us of the birth of Judah's royal twins, Zerah and Pharez. Genesis chapter 38, verses 27 through 30. According to the Bible, a scarlet thread was tied to Zerah's hand as it appeared from the womb, signifying that he came first. But his hand went back in, and Pharez was born. Had it not been for that thread, the Pharez branch of Judah would have reigned from the start. However, Zerah of the scarlet thread was legally considered the firstborn, and as such, the Zerahites ruled over the Hebrews during their sojourn in Egypt. Imagine the centuries of envy caused by that thread. Eventually, the Pharezites would come to power in the Holy Land because the Zerah branch fled from Egypt to Greece and elsewhere. See Volume 1. The Pharezites could then claim Rahab's secret signal as a scarlet thread of their own, and her lineage produced King David, Solomon, and Jesus. With the death of Joshua, central authority among the Hebrews vanished for 4 centuries. The tribes of Israel dispersed as they set out to acquire their particular territorial allotments. An occasional alliance formed between different tribes when the need arose to help each other, but for the most part the individual tribes acted independently. During this time, judges such as Deborah, Gideon, and Samson led groups of Israelites in battles. One of the most gruesome biblical episodes of this period is recorded in Judges chapters 19 through 21. It deals with the rape, death, and mutilation of a Levite's concubine. The crime was committed in the territory of Benjamin. According to the record, all the tribes gathered to demand the lives of the guilty men, and when the Benjamites refused to hand them over, civil war commenced. The small Benjamite army killed tens of thousands of their Israelite brothers. But the tide of battle changed. Men, women, and children were destroyed in a genocide that left the tribe of Benjamin with only 600 men. Realizing they were about to wipe out an entire tribe, the Israelites came to their senses. We read, "And they said, There must be an inheritance for them that be escaped of Benjamin, that a tribe be not destroyed out of Israel." Judges chapter 21, verse 17. If this verse is taken prophetically, then somewhere on our globe all of the tribes of Israel exist. Christians can be thankful that the remaining Benjamites were allowed to survive and take wives. Otherwise, the tribe's most notable member, Paul the Apostle, would never have been born. In time, the people demanded a return to central leadership. Although the right to rule belongs to the royal tribe of Judah, a Benjamite named Saul was made king. But at the end of the 11th century BC, Saul's short-lived dynasty gave way to King David of the Pharez branch of Judah. We read, "So all the elders of Israel came to the king to Hebron, and King David made a league with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel." 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 3. David fought many battles and established his capital at Jerusalem. When the united tribes controlled the land and their enemies ceased hostilities, 2 Samuel chapter 7 says the prophet Nathan brought David some remarkable promises from God. The promises include a perpetual dynasty for the house of David and the assurance of an additional country for Israel. Prophecies of a never-ending Davidic line are well known and studied by scholars, although few experts dare to name the person occupying David's throne on earth today. But the promise of another land for Israel is rarely examined. We read, "Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own, and move no more. Neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more as beforetime. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 10. This other place in which Israel will move no more cannot be Palestine, for history shows that not only were the so-called lost tribes deported, but when the Romans came, they expelled Jews from the Holy Land too. The condition stipulated in the promise concerning the children of wickedness, who would afflict Israel no more, which is a reference to Egypt and neighboring countries, also eliminates Palestine as the other land. For Egypt and her allies have fought the Jews in several wars since the Jewish return to Palestine in AD 1948. While Volume 3 examines the perpetual dynasty and explains who sits on David's throne today, this volume offers evidence that the other land is the British Isles. When David died, his 10th son Solomon ascended the throne. History records him as the great builder of the temple at Jerusalem. Through treaties and marriages, Solomon also secured a relative degree of peace between Israel and her neighbors. By the end of his life, he had negotiated so many deals, sealed with the acceptance of brides, that his personal harem contained 700 wives and 300 concubines. These foreign women, including an Egyptian princess, caused Solomon to worship their pagan gods. For his sin of idolatry, the Lord said, "I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and will give it to thy servant. Notwithstanding in thy days I will not do it for David thy father's sake, but I will rend it out of the hand of thy son. Howbeit I will not render away all the kingdom, but will give one tribe to thy son for David my servant's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, which I have chosen." 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 11 through 13. This predicted split occurred around 930 BC, when Solomon died and his son Rehoboam came to power. David's dynasty continued as promised, but the kingdom's size was greatly reduced. In order to pay for the splendid temple, plus other extensive building projects, taxation during Solomon's reign was described as a heavy yoke. According to 1 Kings chapter 12, a tax rebellion ensued when King Rehoboam refused to lighten the yoke and threatened to increase it. The small tribe of Benjamin remained loyal to the royal tribe of Judah, as did the Levite priests spread throughout the land, but the other tribes chose a man named Jeroboam for their king, as predicted by the prophet Ahijah. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 31. Jeroboam had been in charge of part of the construction work under Solomon. The rebellion produced a divided Israel with two independent nations. King Rehoboam reigned in Jerusalem over the two-tribed southern nation known as the House of Judah. In time, all the people of the southern kingdom were simply called Jews or Judeans. King Jeroboam, from the birthright tribe of Ephraim, led the 10-tribed nation referred to in the Bible by such names as Israel, Samaria, Ephraim, the northern kingdom, and the house of Israel. It is important to understand that there are two separate nations. Indeed, the first biblical reference to Jews says they were attacked by Israel. 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 5 through 6. When the Israelites were united, their borders stretched from Egypt to the river Euphrates. United, they were too powerful for their neighbors to conquer. But now that they were bitter enemies and divided, the decades that followed brought warfare. Numerous battles were waged against such nations as Egypt, Moab, and Syria, as described in the biblical books of Kings and Chronicles. And 2 centuries of hatred, filled with a pattern of on and off fighting, existed between the house of Israel and the house of Judah. King Jeroboam died around 909 BC. His son Nadab reigned over the house of Israel for 2 years. The dynasty of Jeroboam came to an end when Nadab was assassinated by Baasha of the house of Issachar. 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 27. Baasha destroyed the entire lineage of the house of Jeroboam, and he established Tirzah as the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. When King Baasha died, his son Elah reigned for 2 years. King Elah in turn was murdered by Zimri, the captain of half his chariots. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 9. Zimri took the throne and then executed the entire male lineage of the house of Baasha. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 11. When news spread that Zimri had seized power around 885 BC, warriors from the 10 tribes made Omri their king. Omri was captain of the army that was besieging the Philistines at Gibbethon. We read, "And Omri went up from Gibbethon, and all Israel with him, and they besieged Tirzah. And it came to pass, when Zimri saw that the city was taken, that he went into the palace of the king's house, and burnt the king's house over him with fire, and died." 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 17 through 18. After the fiery suicide of Zimri, the 10 northern tribes split into 2 parts. Half of the people made a man named Tibni their king, while the other half continued to follow Omri. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 21. In circa 880 BC, King Tibni died, and King Omri gained control over all the house of Israel. Since the palace had been burnt to the ground in Zimri's suicide, Omri chose another site for his royal residence. We read, "And he bought the hill Samaria of Shemer for 2 talents of silver, and built on the hill, and called the name of the city which he built after the name of Shemer, owner of the hill, Samaria." 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 24. King Omri established Samaria as the new capital of the northern nation. The neighboring countries took notice of his deed. For example, the Assyrians, with their capital at Nineveh, would soon regard the house of Israel as Beth Cumri, meaning the house of Omri. Omri's name became synonymous with Israel. During the dynasty started by Omri, the house of Israel grew in stature. A temporary peace was made with the house of Judah, and the nation of Moab was subjugated. Archaeology has recovered the famous Moabite stone confirming the importance of Omri. The stone monument was erected in the 9th century BC by King Mesha of Moab. It recounts a local victory achieved against Israel. Excerpts from the Moabite stone declare that Omri, king of Israel, oppressed Moab many days, and his son succeeded him, but I have triumphed over him and over his house. Actually, according to 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 27, the house of Omri, or Israel, decided to stop their onslaught of Moab when Mesha sacrificed his eldest son in front of them. Omri's son Ahab was the next man to rule over the 10 tribes. In order to strengthen Israel's relations with the coastal cities, he had married Jezebel, a Phoenician princess from Tyre. While troubles persisted with Syria, all the kingdoms in the region soon faced a greater threat, the Assyrians. From Nineveh, the Assyrians were carving out an empire. They gained control of their southern neighbors in Babylon. They pushed westward to collect tribute from the cities of Phoenicia, and they moved into Syria. In 853 BC, King Shalmaneser III of Assyria fought a coalition of 12 kings at the Battle of Karkar in Syria. His famous monolithic inscription, the Kirk Stele, lists Ahab the Israelite as part of the coalition. Shalmaneser claimed victory, but it seems that Ahab and the others achieved at least a draw, since years went by before the Assyrians advanced beyond Karkar and into Israel. When Ahab died, the next kings of the house of Omri returned to local warfare against Moab and Syria. Omri's dynasty came to an end around 841 BC. At that time, Elisha the prophet sent a young man to Jehu, a captain of the army, to anoint him king of the northern nation. Jehu was told to exterminate all the sons of Ahab, and he obeyed. See 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 11. It is important to realize that King Jehu and Omri were unrelated, but in the Assyrian point of view, all the rulers of the house of Israel at Omri's capital, the city of Samaria, were looked upon as members of Beth Cumri, the house of Omri. We learn this from the Black Obelisk, a monument of Shalmaneser III, depicting his military accomplishments. One scene on the obelisk shows Jehu paying homage. An inscription reads, "The tribute of Jehu, son of Omri." From its beginning, the house of Israel worshipped strange gods under the rule of King Jeroboam. The prophet Ahijah predicted that one day the Lord shall root up Israel out of this good land, and he shall scatter them beyond the river Euphrates. 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 15. In the 8th century BC, the prophet Hosea elaborated on this prediction through the naming of his 3 children. We read, "And the Lord said unto him, Call his name Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. Call her name Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. Call his name Lo-Ami, for ye are not my people, and I will not be your God. Hosea chapter 1 verse 4, 6, and 9. The name Jezreel means God will sow, as in scattering. Lo-Ruhamah means not pitied, as in not having mercy. And Lo-Ami means not my people. Hosea also prophesied that once they were scattered, the house of Israel would grow into a vast multitude. And in the place where it was said unto them, Ye are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, Ye are the sons of the living God. Hosea chapter 1 verse 10. Their immediate future looked disastrous and dismal, but ultimately these so-called lost tribes would become Christian nations that worship the living God. In 745 BC, Tiglath-Pileser became king of Assyria. To control the empire, he instituted a resettlement policy against troublesome tribes. Tiglath-Pileser moved them hundreds of miles from their tribal homelands in order to stop any influence they may have had on neighboring sheiks. This prevented larger revolts. He placed the deportees in buffer states to act as military cushions against the empire's greater enemies. During his reign, Tiglath-Pileser, also known as Pul, marched toward the Holy Land and received tribute from King Menahem of Israel. The payoff ensured that the Assyrian army turned back and stayed not there in the land. 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 20. When Menahem died, his son reigned for 2 years. The son was overthrown by one of his captains, a man named Pekah. King Pekah of Israel joined forces with the king of Syria and attacked the Jews. In response, King Ahaz of the house of Judah sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am thy servant and thy son. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Syria, and out of the hand of the king of Israel. 2 Kings chapter 16, verse 7. At the request of Ahaz, the Assyrians returned with violence. We read, In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and took Ijon, and Abel-Beth-Maachah, and Janoah, and Kedesh, and Hazor, and Gilead, and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and carried them captive to Assyria. 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 29. This large portion of the house of Israel was conquered by 732 BC. According to 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 26, the Assyrians took even the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and brought them unto Halah and Habor and Herah, and to the river Gozan. According to the traditional theory, the captured members of the House of Israel were deported north to a buffer zone on the other side of the Euphrates. It is believed that Halah and Habor were towns along the river Kabur. Scholars point to the similarity of Habor and Kabur. The traditional theory also says that Harah is the same city as Haran, and Gozan is located on a tributary of the Kabur. But other theories exist because these places, or places with similar sounding names, can be identified throughout Mesopotamia. Indeed, the Kabur, river or canal, is a common name within the Tigris and Euphrates water networks. Shalmaneser V, 727 through 722 BC, was the next king of Assyria to invade the remaining people in the house of Israel. He came at a time when Israel was ruled by King Hoshea, and he besieged Samaria. Shalmaneser died before the capital fell, but King Sargon II completed the task in 722 BC. The Assyrian annals record Sargon's boast of successfully capturing Samaria and carrying off 27,290 of the people. In 721 BC, all the Israelites in the northern kingdom had been conquered and deported. We read, And the king of Assyria did carry away Israel unto Assyria, and put them in Halah and in Habor by the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 11. Also see 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 6. The 8th century BC marks the historical beginning of the so-called lost tribes. The house of Judah remained a viable nation in the Promised Land, but as the prophets predicted, Israel was gone. See 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 18. The deportation in 721 BC brought Israel to the Halah, Habor, and Gozan buffer zone, just like the first resettlement in 732 BC. An area called the Cities of the Medes is also mentioned, indicating the establishment of a second buffer, 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 6. The Medes lived in Media, the northwestern part of present-day Iran at the southern end of the Caspian Sea. The city of Ecbatana would serve as their capital. The city of Rages is modern-day Tehran. According to the Septuagint version of 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 6, the Assyrians placed the house of Israel in Alay and in Abor, near the rivers of Gozan, and in the mountains of the Medes. A second theory on the location of the buffer zones says that all deportees from Israel were dumped into a single region, a region centered around the Kezel Ozan, by the cities and mountains of the Medes. Adherents to this theory believe the Kezel Ozan River is the river Gozan, Halah, Alay, is the town of Kalkal, and Habor is Abhar. The total number of buffer zones, 1, 2, or even more, is still not determined. In this author's mind, the traditional theory of 2 zones seems correct, for in later history the lost tribes appear as 2 separate groups. This would indicate that at some point in time the deportees became divided. If the Assyrians had placed them in 2 buffer zones at the start, then with the passage of time their subsequent and continued separation is understandable. According to Assyrian records, Jews, or those of the house of Judah or from Judea, were also taken during the conquest of Palestine. This fact, that a large portion of the house of Judah underwent deportation, is frequently overlooked. In the days of mighty Tiglath-Pileser, Judeans are mentioned as captives. They were transferred to the border region of northern Syria. The majority of the Jewish citizens were removed during the reign of Assyria's king Sennacherib, 704 to 681 BC. The Annals of Sennacherib appear on the famous Taylor Prism in the British Museum, and on a similar clay cylinder at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. The Annals say, "As to Hezekiah the Jew, he did not submit to my yoke. I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities, walled forts, and to the countless small villages in their vicinity, and conquered them. I drove out of them 200,150 people, young and old, male and female." The chronology offered in the Bible dates this huge expulsion of Jews to 701 BC. We read, "Now it came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the defenced cities of Judah and took them." Isaiah chapter 36, verse 1. Also see 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 13. Although Jerusalem held out against the invaders, many citizens of Judah were conquered and sent to the buffer zones. The lost tribes obtained a certain degree of autonomy within the buffer zones. This is deduced from the book of Tobit. It provides a glimpse into their lives. According to the book, Tobit was a member of the tribe of Naphtali, one of the first Israelite tribes captured in 732 BC. During the reign of Shalmaneser, he became the purchasing agent for all the king's needs. We read, "Every now and then until his death I would go to Media to buy goods for him. I also deposited several pouches containing a great sum of money with my kinsman Gabriel, son of Gabri, who lived at Rages in Media." It stands to reason that if the lost tribes had been enslaved, then Assyria's king would not have paid them for their goods. Therefore, common sense says that Tobit's Israelite kinsmen possessed some amount of freedom in the zones. During the last century, archaeologists Sir Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam uncovered the ancient archives of Nineveh. When the 23,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments were translated in part, scholars learned that some of the records deal with events involving the lost tribes. Among the tablets are frontier reports from Assyrian spies at the border of Euroto. The reports say that in 707 BC, the king of Euroto brought his armed forces south by Lake Van toward Lake Urmia in Media to attack the land of Gamir. According to Assyrian Royal Letter 197, the Euretian army was slaughtered when people from the land of Gamir counterattacked. The surviving soldiers were chased out of the buffer state and back into their own country. At any moment, the spies expected the land of Eureto to be conquered by people from the land of Gamir. Another report confirms that the army of Eureto suffered a complete rout in the conflict. 9 of their governors, or commanders, were slain with the king in full flight. History shows that the Eureteans lost their country, and the initial battlefield, located southeast of Lake Urmia, involved the house of Israel in the buffer zone the Bible calls the cities of the Medes. Were the lost tribes of Israel also known as the people of the land of Gamir, the Gamera, or the Gamira? Previously, the Assyrians labeled them Beth Kumri, meaning house of Omri. Israelites pronounced Omri with a guttural H, which the Assyrians represented as KH or GH, as in Kumri or Gomri. The Assyrians also had a habit of reversing the final syllable in words, so that the RI in Gomri was inverted to IR. Using these facts, experts declare that the lost tribes, Beth Kumri equals Gomri equals Gomir, are the same people the cuneiform tablets describe as living in the land of Gamir. Linguistically, the names Gamir, Gamera, and Gamira are derivatives of Omri. Our ability to keep track of the numerous name changes is essential for studying the lost tribes of Israel. In circa 700 BC, according to the 2 buffer zone theory, the tribes in the Gozan buffer decided to pack up and leave. Perhaps the arrival of the 200,150 Jews deported by Sennacherib in 701 BC gave them the strength to break out. Perhaps the zone could not support the extra people dumped into it. Or maybe the Jews started a back-to-God movement among repentant Israelites, and together they saw a new place where they might keep their statutes, which they never kept in their own land. The prophet Ezra records their departure in one of his visions. We read, "Those are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoners out of their own land, in the time of Hosea the king, whom Shalmaneser the king of Assyria led away captive. But they took this counsel among themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen, and go forth into a further country, where never mankind dwelt, that they might there keep their statutes, which they never kept in their own land. And they entered into Euphrates by the narrow passages of the river, for the Most High then showed signs for them, and held still the flood till they were passed over. For through that country there was a great way to go, namely of a year and a half, and the same region is called Arsareth." 2 Esdras, chapter 13, verses 40 through 45. Note: supporters of the single buffer zone theory believe that after the tribes conquered the Eureto in 707 BC and spread northward into their territory, a portion of the Hebrews decided to cross the Euphrates and head for Arsareth. Some may find it difficult to accept that millions of people would walk away to another land. Yet in recent years we have seen televised pictures of mass migrations. For example, in AD 1994, an estimated 2 million Rwandans left their country to escape tribal fighting. And let us not forget that nearly 2 million Kurds headed for the border regions of Turkey and Iran, following the Persian Gulf War against Saddam Hussein of Iraq. Indeed, the Kurds traveled over some of the same hills and mountains that once felt the footsteps of the lost tribes of Israel. When the Israelites were leaving the buffer zone, the country of Phrygia was invaded from the east by the mysterious Cimmerians. The invasion is mentioned by Greek historians such as Strabo, circa 63 BC through AD 21. The capital of Gordium fell around 696 to 695 BC, and King Midas of Phrygia committed suicide. Midas drank bull's blood, they say, and thus went to his doom. Strabo, Geography, Book 1. Waves of Cimmerians spread northward to take control of the southern shore of the Black Sea. The coastal city of Sinope fell to them, and in a short period of time they occupied territory from Phrygia to Sinope to the headwaters of the Euphrates. Who were these mysterious people? According to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, the origin of the Cimmerians is obscure. But obscurity vanishes when we realize the Cimmerians' invaders were the lost tribes. They left their buffer zone around 700 BC. Ezra tells us they took a year and a half to go through the narrow passages, the headwaters of the Euphrates. Their direction of travel led them straight toward Phrygia, and Gordium was conquered about 2 or 3 years after they crossed the Euphrates. Simply stated, either two groups entered Phrygia at the same historical moment, or the Cimmerians and the lost tribes were one and the same people. Historians know that the Greek name for the Cimmerians is the equivalent of Gemira. Greek authors used the K for that guttural H in Omri, which the Assyrians represented as KH or GH. Therefore, the lost tribes of Israel, called Gamira or Gemara, became the Cimmerians. Information on the Cimmerian members of the lost tribes is found in the writings of Greek historians and the Assyrian archives. These records reveal that in 679 BC, King Esarhaddon of Assyria defeated a Cimmerian Gemira king named Tespah. The battle occurred in a district west of the upper Euphrates, but the Cimmerian nomads were not conquered. Early in the reign of Assyria's Ashurbanipal, 668 through 627 BC, they began spreading into further territory. The states of Tabal and Hilaku looked to Assyria for help. Even the powerful King Gyges of Lydia sought Ashurbanipal's assistance. The Assyrian texts reveal that on the same day Gyges petitioned for help, his Lydian army temporarily repelled the Cimmerian invaders. During his reign, Gyges paid tribute to Ashurbanipal. He also fought against the Greek Ionians at Miletus. Note: in Volume 3, we will learn that the Milesians of Miletus were members of the lost tribes via the pre-Exodus voyages. When Psamtik I of Egypt rebelled against the Assyrian Empire, Gyges stopped paying tribute to the Assyrians and formed an alliance with the Egyptian king. Ashurbanipal cursed the Lydian king and prayed that his body would be thrown down before his enemy. The prayer came true when Gyges died while battling a second Cimmerian incursion. The Lydian capital of Sardis fell to the nomadic invaders in 652 BC. In less than 50 years, the lost tribes had spread across Anatolia, stretching from the Euphrates to Lydia and from the Black Sea to Cilicia. According to the 5th century BC historian Herodotus, King Ardys ruled next in Lydia, circa 651 through 613 BC. During his reign, warfare continued against the Grecian might at Miletus. The Trarans, a tribe from Thrace with close connections to the Cimmerians, entered the region, and once again the Lydian capital of Sardis was sacked. Strabo says that the Trarans were probably Cimmerians. This would indicate that Cimmerian members of the lost tribes had crossed into Thracian territory after conquering Phrygia, Sinope, and the southern shore of the Black Sea, circa 695 through 652 BC. When King Ardys renewed Lydia's relations with Ashurbanipal, the lost tribes began to lose ground in Anatolia. First, the Assyrians managed to drive the Cimmerians out of Cilicia from 637 to 626 BC. Then, around 630 BC, the Milesians successfully planted a colony at Sinope on the Black Sea. And finally, the Lydians grew in strength, and Herodotus credits their king Alyattes with the total expulsion of the Cimmerians at the close of the 7th century BC. Driven from Anatolia, the Cimmerians entered the territory of their Thracian allies and kinsmen. It is interesting to note that an important river in Thrace was called Hebrus, reminding us of the Hebrews. In time, the lost tribes occupied the northwest coast of the Black Sea, including the Crimea. The term Crimea apparently derives from their Cimmerian name. This northwest coast of the Black Sea was Arsareth, the land Ezra saw them heading toward, where they planned to follow the laws of Moses. 2 Esdras chapter 13 verses 42 to 45. The term Arsareth means mountains of Sareth. These mountains are the modern-day Transylvanian Alps and Carpathian Mountains. The Sareth River is spelled Siret on current maps. Evidence suggests that the lost tribes also occupied the territory above Macedonia and Thrace on the southern bank of the Danube. There we find the land of Moesia, bringing to mind Moses and Mashiach, or Messiah. 5th century BC coinage with the name Mosses, tentatively attributed to an unknown chieftain of Macedonia, was perhaps issued instead from this new Israelite region of Moesia. Strabo gives an account of the Moesi people that describes them as God-fearing people. Maybe for a short period of time they did return to the Mosaic laws. Strabo also says that the Moesi people were related to the people in Mysia near Lydia. We should note that the Apostle Paul traveled through Mysia during his mission to take the gospel to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. See Matthew chapter 10 verse 6 and Acts chapter 9 verse 15, also Acts chapter 16 verse 7. Along the Danube, from the regions of Arsareth and Moesia, emerged a group of people that the Greeks called Celts. In circa 600 BC, the Celts were already migrating westward, using the Danube as a highway into Europe. Historians regard their new culture as part of the Hallstatt period. This is in reference to the great finds discovered by Johann Ramsauer at Hallstatt, a village in central Austria, in AD 1846. From about the 5th to the 1st centuries BC, Celts were the dominant force in Europe. This was their Latine period, named for the culture uncovered at Latine in Switzerland. The Celts settled all of France and crossed the Pyrenees into the Iberian Peninsula of Spain. In the 5th century BC, Herodotus declares that Celtic tribes were also living beyond the Pillars of Hercules. This indicates that some had sailed to Ireland, just like the tribe of Dan, and to Britain, like the Trojans of Judah at New Troy. In the 1st century BC, the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus says the Romans call the Celts Gauls, and in ancient times they were called Cimmerians. Library of History, Book 5. With knowledge of these changing names, Beth Cumri equals Gomri equals Gemira equals Cimmerians equals Celts. Scholars proclaim that the Celtic nations are the lost tribes of Israel. While waves of Celtic Hebrews followed the Danube into the heart of Europe, other Cimmerians were driven north when Scythians invaded Arsareth in the 6th century BC. They were pushed along the Carpathian Mountains to the Baltic Sea. Diodorus says that these Cimmerians dwell beneath the Bears, which means Poland, Germany, Holland, Denmark, and the rest of Scandinavia under the Bear constellations of Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. Diodorus adds that the people of Cimbri, the Cimbrians, derived their name from Cimmerians. Note that the Celts of Wales may also retain their Cimmerian name, for they are called Cymri. Western Europe, from top to bottom, belongs to the lost tribes. Around 400 BC, they entered northern Italy and overran the Etruscans. Roman citizens soon became their lifelong foes when, according to Diodorus, Celts captured their city. Rome suffered this bitter humiliation circa 390 BC. About 55 years after their brief capture of Rome, Alexander the Great met with the lost tribes along the Danube. He sought a treaty of friendship that would keep the Celts out of Greece, allowing him to go off and conquer the Persian Empire. Although Alexander was concerned that he failed to impress them, the treaty held firm. But after his reign, Celts did invade Greece, plundering the sanctuary at Delphi in 279 BC. One group, the Galatei, even returned to Anatolia and resettled the old Phrygian territory. This territory became known as Galatia. Most scholars believe that the Apostle Paul's Galatians letter went to their Celtic descendants. During the Punic Wars, Romans worried that the Carthaginians would unite with the Celts to destroy them. In fact, it almost happened when Hannibal tried to form a Celtic-Carthaginian alliance as he crossed the Pyrenees to attack Italy in 218 BC. But Rome survived, won the wars, and in time became the master of Europe. The Celts, especially the lost tribes living in Britain, fought many battles against the Romans as they struggled for independence. And when Rome's empire eventually crumbled, the lost tribes regained control of Western Europe to this day. We have traced the Celtic Israelites from the Gozan buffer zone to Europe. Let us now learn what happened to the lost tribes living in the cities of the Medes buffer. They were responsible for defeating the Eurasians in 707 BC. The victory gave them control of the land above Lakes Van and Urmia, up to the region of Colchis. See Volume 1 on the Hebrew connection to Colchis. The Assyrians called them Gemira, but with the victory over Urartu, these members of the lost tribes threw off that label in favor of a more meaningful name, the name of their patriarch Isaac. Prior to their deportations, the prophet Amos, circa 760 BC, had already called them the house of Isaac, Amos chapter 7 verse 9. And some believe they fulfilled one aspect of an ancient prophecy given to Abraham, which says, "For in Isaac shall thy seed be called." See Genesis chapter 21 verse 12. Evidence shows that the people in the house of Isaac became known as the fearsome Scythians. Prayer texts belonging to Assyria's king Esarhaddon, 680 through 669 BC, mentioned the anxiety he felt concerning the increasing might and intentions of these lost tribes. He calls them Iskuza warriors. The name Iskuza is derived from Isaac, or Isaka. In Hebrew, the different forms of Isaac include Yitzchak, Yitzchok, Sokak, and Sokak. Throughout these variations, the SK sound persists, the same SK sound found in the Assyrian term Iskuza. The initial I in Iskuza is dropped in Greek forms of the name, such as Skute, from which the term Scythian derives. Esarhaddon's concerns caused him to form an alliance with the Scythians, and he gave his daughter in marriage to an Iskuza king named Bardatua. The Scythians grew in power and quickly extended their territory to include the southern and eastern shores of the Caspian Sea. Some of them headed east, reaching Afghanistan. Others attacked northward across the Araxes River. Archaeological artifacts, datable bronze bowls, reveal that the site of Karmir Blur was destroyed around 625 BC. About this same time, Herodotus says a group of Scythians briefly invaded Syria and Palestine. Perhaps this was an attempt to return to the Promised Land. The Egyptian ruler Psamtik I, circa 663 to 610 BC, sought a treaty to keep them out of Egypt, and he purchased peace from them. In addition to their swift attacks, the Scythians were known for their rapid ability to pack up and move their family tents or booths. Some suspect that the Hebrew Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, called Sukkoth, is the source for their Scythian name. The Assyrian Empire collapsed when Babylonians and Medes rebelled. The Scythians also attacked, and the nomadic Hebrews participated in the fall of Nineveh in 612 BC. A few years later, the remaining Assyrian forces at Haran were destroyed, and the Scythians returned to their territory north of Lakes Van and Urmia. The Babylonians and Medes entered into a treaty. The granddaughter of King Cyaxares the Mede was given in marriage to Prince Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and the two allies divided the world equally among themselves. The treaty designated all the land south and west of the Tigris River to the Babylonians, which would soon spell doom for the house of Judah and Egypt. The regions north and east of the Tigris, which included all land belonging to the Scythians, were assigned to the Medes. This led to repeated conflicts between the lost tribes and the Medes, the Medo-Persian Empire. Herodotus claims that the Medes regained their territory around the Caspian Sea when King Cyaxares, 625 to 585 BC, assassinated a great number of Scythians. To carry out this deed, he made sure the Scythians were drunk during a banquet. Later, from 590 to 585 BC, a war took place between King Alyattes of Lydia and Cyaxares. Herodotus says this Median-Lydian war occurred when Cyaxares belittled the hunting skills of certain Scythians. In turn, the Scythians murdered one of his young boys, presented the body's meat as fresh game for the Median king, and then fled to Alyattes, who refused to hand them over when the Medes arrived. The fighting lasted until the Babylonians mediated a peace agreement in 585 BC. In order for this Median-Lydian war to have taken place in Anatolia, Cyaxares must have first forced his way through the lost tribes above Lake Van. These Scythians were pushed northward across the Araxes River. From the fall of Nineveh to the start of the Median-Lydian War, about 612 through 590 BC, members of the lost tribes traversed the Caucasus through the Dariel Pass. It is interesting to note that one of the peaks bordering the pass, this Scythian Gate, or the Gate of Israel, is called Mount Zion. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, AD 23 through 79, refers to the pass as the Gates of the Caucasus, which he places in the region of Iberia. Natural History, Book 6. The term Iberia, or Iberia, denotes the land of Hebrews, located south of the Caucasus along the river Kura. Pliny also mentions a tributary of the Kura called the river Iberus, meaning the Hebrew River. Book 6. Upon reaching the other side of the pass, the lost tribes occupied the territory around the northeast shore of the Black Sea. The earliest Scythian tomb at Calirmis dates to circa 580 BC. Further incursions westward were instrumental in moving their Cimmerian brothers out of Arsareth, as previously explained. In 550 BC, the Persian leader Cyrus the Great acquired the empire of the Medes. He and his army spent the next few years subduing the Lydians and conquering Anatolia. Then, in 539 BC, Cyrus captured Babylon, uniting the Babylonian Empire south and west of the Tigris with his Medo-Persian Empire. Historical records during the period of Persian dominance present the world as through the victor's eyes. As expected, the lost tribes acquired another designation, the term Saki. Herodotus says these people armed themselves with bows, daggers, and the Sagaris battle axe, and that Saki is the name the Persians gave to all Scythian tribes. Book 7. Diodorus Siculus adds that the Scythians living east of the Caspian Sea were also known as the Saki. Book 2. And Pliny confirms that the Persians gave the general name of Saki to Scythian tribes. The term Saki has the same SK sound found in Iskuza and Skute, the Assyrian and Greek names for Scythians, which in turn come from Isaka or Isaac. Indeed, Diodorus states that when these people grew in strength, they got the name Saki from one of their notable kings. Book 2. Clearly, the great patriarch Isaac remained famous among the lost tribes, the house of Isaac. Amos chapter 7, verse 16. About 529 BC, Cyrus the Great died while battling the lost tribes. According to Herodotus, the Persian leader suffered a gruesome end fighting the forces of Queen Tamiris of the Massagetae. The term Massagetae means the great sag or sack horde. Scholars assert that the SG sound in sag is equivalent to the SK in Saki. Therefore, the Saki and Massagetae comprise the same people. The Sagaris battle axe of the Saki, with its SG sound, was probably named after them, sags or sacks. While Herodotus says the Massagetae killed Cyrus, note that Diodorus credits the queen of the Scythians with the deed. Book 2. Saki, Massagetae, and Scythians are synonymous names for the lost tribes. In fact, the Scythian territory in Armenia, between the Araxes and Kura rivers, was known as Sakacene. Pliny calls it Sakasani in Book 6. During the reign of Darius the Great, 521 to 486 BC, the Persian armies again waged war with the lost tribes. This time, instead of fighting the Massagetae, the empire went after the royal Scyths of Scythia. These Scythians were descendants of those who traversed the Darial Pass. They occupied the Crimea and much of Arsareth on the north shore of the Black Sea. In order to attack them, King Darius led his troops across the Bosphorus into Thrace. He then bridged the Danube and invaded their country. According to Herodotus, the Scythians kept out of range while depriving their enemy of food and water. Book 4. They did this by destroying pastures and blocking up the wells and springs. They allowed Darius just enough food to keep his men marching in a weakened state, and they harassed the Persians at opportune moments. One night, in complete frustration, Darius left camp with his strongest soldiers to march back across the Danube. Upon realizing that their king had fled, those that remained in camp surrendered to the Scythians. Southwest of Ecbatana, along an old caravan route at the foot of the Zagros Mountains in Iran, King Darius created a giant billboard to advertise his might. The monument is about 150 feet long by 100 feet high, carved on the face of a mountain called the Behistun Rock. It consists of large panels with sculptures and columns of inscriptions on them. The inscriptions present the same information in 3 languages: Persian, Susian, and Babylonian, making the monument a cuneiform equivalent of the Rosetta Stone. The carved text on the Behuston Rock were first copied by Henry Rawlinson from AD 1835 to 1847. After they were translated, we learned the texts contain identical lists of provinces which Darius claims are subject unto me. Despite his failed conquest of Scythia, Darius lists some Scythians among the subjugated people. In the Persian inscription, they are called Saki. The Susian text also names them Saki or Saka, but when the Babylonian version reaches this point in the list of provinces, it says Cimmerians. 2 other trilingual inscriptions belonging to Darius, one on a sheet of gold and one in his tomb, also equate the Scythians with the Cimmerians. These writings prove that Scythians and Cimmerians are the same people, the lost tribes. In the 5th century BC, the royal Scyths and their Thracian brothers were allied through marriage. In the 4th century BC, an eastern people called Sarmatians began crossing the river Don and pressuring the Scythians. The invaders gradually forced the lost tribes away from the region. Beginning in about the 2nd century BC, the Scythians headed northwestward to the Baltic Sea. And in the 2nd century AD, the Sarmatians successfully supplanted all the Scythians around the Black Sea. The Romans found it geographically confusing to still call the territory along the Black Sea Scythia, since the Scythians had left. Therefore, they designated that region Sarmati, because the Sarmatians were in control. And to eliminate any chance of misidentification, the term Germani was introduced for the Scythians living up north. The word Germani means genuine, as in the true or real Scythians. Strabo, Book 7, says the Germani are the genuine Galati, Celts. But scholars believe Strabo misunderstood the Roman logic behind the name change, and suspect instead that Germani was introduced to denote the original or genuine Scythians. The Germani flourished by the Baltic Sea. In time, distinct tribal names such as Angles, Jutes, Frisians, Picts, and Saxons appeared across northern Europe. God promised his people an additional land, which many believe is Britain. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 10. Thus, the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain in the 5th century AD was simply an influx of Israelites to the land. The Viking and Norman invasions added more Hebrews. When Picts arrived in the British Isles, the historian Bede, circa AD 673 to 735, calls them Picts from Scythia, History of the English Church and People, Book 1. The poet John Milton, AD 1608 to 1674, says that the Saxons are descended of the Saki, a kind of Scythians in the north of Asia, thence called Saxons, or sons of Saki. History of England, Book 3. The term Saxon retains the SK sound, linking them to the sons of Sac, or Isaac's sons. Saxon and Scandinavian rulers claim Odin as their ancestor. Historian Snorre Sturluson, AD 1179 to 1241, reveals that Odin lived by the Black Sea before heading north. He led part of the Scythian migration in the days of the Roman general Pompey, 106 to 48 BC. Odin's genealogy is also traced to the Trojans of Judah. In Volume 1, we learned that the lion symbolizes Judah, and the eagle and snake belong to the tribe of Dan. These tribal emblems are found among the Scythians. For example, Diodorus says the Scythians believed their ancestor was born from a woman whose lower body resembled that of a snake. Book 2. And the mythical griffin, comprising the head of an eagle and the body of a lion, is primarily associated with the Scythians. In Volume 1, we also learned that the tribe of Dan has the habit of marking the territory it reaches with the DN letters of its name. Like signposts along a trail, these DN marks, Dan, Den, Din, Don, and Dun, extend from the Black Sea to the British Isles. For example, if we start in Eastern Europe and head west, the same direction the lost tribes traveled, we cross the rivers Don, Donets, Dnieper, once called Danapri, Dnester, also known as Danistri, the long Danube, Eridan, which is now the Po, and Rodan, now called the Rhone. The DN signposts stretch from Macedonia in the south to Poland's north port of Danzig, which is also called Dansk. Danzig is located by the Kodan Gulf. Perhaps the Danes of Scandinavia are the most obvious link to the tribe of Dan. Their entire Danish country of Denmark, or Denmark, is named from Danemark, meaning Dan's land. When the lost tribes reached the British Isles, the DN marks continued. In Scotland, called Caledonia, modern maps show many DN places such as Dundee, Dunbar, Denholm, and Aberdeen, near the mouth of the River Don. Britain's Devonshire was known as Danonia, and the number of DN names in Ireland, from Dundalk Bay to Dingle Bay to Donegal Bay, bring to mind the Tuatha De Danann, the tribe of Dan. Celts, Anglo-Saxons, and Scandinavians represent the House of Israel. Their kinsmen include the pre-Exodus Hebrews of Spain and Greece, and the Trojan Britons and Romans. From Australia to Iceland, they have colonized our globe, and no doubt Israelite elements still exist in the old regions of Galatia, Euroto, and Colchis. The New World was established by Hebrew colonials from Spain, France, and Britain. Many identify the USA as the superpower tribe of Manasseh. The British Commonwealth represents the multitude of nations in the tribe of Ephraim, Genesis chapter 48, verse 19. The lost tribes of Israel were quick to embrace Christianity. These pagan nations that the Lord once described as not my people have truly become, in Christ, sons of the living God. Hosea chapter 1, verse 10.